I'm about to show you something amazing if you're working with Azure Functions and SQL. Do stay tuned and let's check it out. Hi everyone, my name is Fani Reinders and Microsoft Build just happened a couple of days ago and we saw a bunch of awesome new features that has been announced and updates that has been kind of set available. One of which is bindings for SQL in Azure Functions. Super excited about this one, especially if you're using SQL in your Azure Functions. Let me quickly show you how easy it is to set up. I have a sandbox environment set up here. And what we'll do is we'll just create a new folder. We'll call this to-do app. And we'll just cd into the to-do app. And we will then use the functions CLI to quickly spawn up a new Azure Functions from scratch. And we do that by going func new, and we call it to-do app. And the template we'll use HTTP trigger. And while that's doing its thing, it will now kind of create the new HTTP trigger from the template. And this is the exact same template that we all know and love that we can just run quickly. We run that by go func start. And while that's starting up, we'll see after a few seconds, it found endpoints. And one of the endpoints it found is this whole to-do app endpoint, which is the get and the post endpoint here, which is quite cool. Great. So to invoke that, I'm actually using a tool called .NET HTTP REPL that you can install by querying or executing the command .NET tool install g .NET HTTP REPL, and that will actually give you ability to query the any HTTP endpoint using the CLI. And furthermore, if you're using Open API specification, it will allow you to discover, or actually it will discover all the endpoints in the API to be able to give you more context of the API that you are querying. So in our case, I already installed it and on my machine. Let's call out to that function to kind of show you how it works. HTTP REPL, and it's HTTP localhost 7071. And in a sec, it will connect to that endpoint. And like you said, it cannot find any Open API specification. So it will just attempt to connect and execute any command you throw at it. Now, the command we want to do is get. It's API and it's to-do app. And I believe that it expects a name, right? So here we say, hello, Fani, this is HTTP trigger function executed successfully. So this is nothing new. This is stock standard, but it's just to kind of show you what, how easy it is to create a Azure Functions. Beside the point, quickly closing this whole thing here. Hot Reload has been released as part of, I don't know which part of .NET's SDK, but unfortunately, Hot Reload is not part of Azure Functions yet, but a way around it, we can actually do a kind of a trick to get Hot Reload working. Let's quickly open up Visual Studio Code to make that work. So for those that do not know what Hot Reload is, we want the ability to watch for file changes within our workspace. So whenever there's a file change, it needs to be recompiled and run. So it's not exactly hot reload, but it's kind of, at least it kind of helps us to not go .NET run all the time and maybe forget to do a build in between. To do this, we will just go to our CSproj file and we'll create a new target. And we call this target, for instance, run functions. And then we will say this is, in a second, we'll hopefully try to ask to close the target there. There we go. And the task that we want to execute here is func start, right? It's this exact same thing that we wanted to start earlier, but now we just started within the context of .NET. Now, the way we run this is we can just go, for instance, .NET watch, and then we say msbuild run the task run function, run functions. And that will now go and build our application and run it and watch for changes. Very important. Going back to Visual Studio Code. So this is Visual Studio Code. Before I actually go in there, I actually want to stop this quickly. We need to add a package, a special package that's included for this whole release. Back to the whole point of this whole video about SQL Bindings, we need to add a new package to Visual Studio Code. And we do this by just going to the CLI and add a new package. And this package is called .NET add package Microsoft Azure Web Jobs extensions .SQL, and that's a pre-release. Very important to specify the pre-release there because it's not launched yet officially. That will go ahead and download the package from NuGet, and we will see it will be added to our NuGet repository, which is it will be added to our CS proj file over there. Great. So going back to our application, let's clean this up a bit. Right. So we want to build an application to read in a bunch of to-do items and to query to-do items using SQL as the backend store. So how do we do this? First and foremost, we have our function to-do app, which is not really what we want. Let's call this create to-dos. And here we call this function just create, and then we'll add just the capability of posting, because post mutates or post creates a resource. And in terms of the route, we'll call it to-dos. Okay, nothing major. I'm also going to remove a bunch of these details from the function that we don't need. Then we're going to be using the SQL binding. To do that, we say SQL, and we can now specify the table. So the SQL binding, and the table is to do. SQL connection string, we need to also specify. Connection info, or the connection string setting name, in this case, was SQL connection. You might also notice that we have a bunch of errors here. So first and foremost, we have a SQL connection. That's the setting that we need to add. So we do that by going to our local settings. We first need to add setting there. Let's go SQL connection. And this is the connection to the SQL database that we will have. I've got mine local. So we'll say local DB, and hopefully Copilot will kick in. Nice. The database in this case is to do DB. We'll keep the defaults from that. Going back here, and then we will be prompted that it's a async collector of to-dos. So to-dos in this case, it's it represents the table of the SQL table that we have here. That doesn't exist, so let's quickly create a new class in a new file called to-do. Typically, the Copilot generates a bunch of things for us. It's ID, title, and completed. I'm just going to change this to good to be more kind of in line of what the types are currently. But for the rest, it's basically the same thing. What we also want is a kind of a wrapper class, right? So we have a public class to-do items, and that will contain a list of to-do items in an array. Because this is a bulk insert API that we're busy building here. The first thing we want to do now is to actually get the content from the body. We do that by saying body is, and let's see what Copilot suggests. Reads the body, that's fine. Reads the body from the request. And then also what we'll need to do is we need to say to-dos is a JSON convert or JSON deserialized of a to-do list. So this to-do list is really not correct. This should be to-do items, which is a wrapper in the body. So this will deserialize the payload into a strongly typed object called items. So the next thing to do now is to kind of iterate through the items here. So I'm just going to go and say for each item in items. And then what we will do is before we add it to the table, we want to create a new ID from it. And we'll do that by going item.id is, and let's say Copilot generates a new ID for us. That's great. And then we call in todos.add async with that item. And at the end, we need to flush our changes. And we do that by going await.todo.flush async. When that's done, we'll just say, great, that's been added. Give me an OK result. And that's fine. So we have our to-dos that's binding to a SQL with the connection string here. And then what will happen is when the request comes in, we serialize the request into a to-do items object. And then we add it to the table that's represented in SQL, and that is it. Let's go see how that works. After a quick save, going back to our terminal, we need to run our application. So let's quickly run .NET Watch MS Build. I actually forgot to run that command. And in a second, we will see the application starting up with the correct endpoint, hopefully. There we go. Now we can see that the application has to-dos in there. To test it out, we can use our HTTP REPL. To do this, we go post API to-dos. And for the body, it will actually pop up a code editor. In my case, I've configured VS Code as the code editor. And of course, here you can define your payload of the body that you want to post. But I actually want to show you something else. I have installed an extension called Expando that I've created myself a couple of years ago. And this allows us to do cool things to generate kind of JSON, CSV, and all that kind of other things for our testing data. For example, you can go, for instance, fname, lname, and it will kind of, if you go then press Shift Enter, it will generate a completely random object with a first name and last name, etc. Do check out the link below about Expando and how you can use Expando in VS Code. In this case, we have items, and we'll call items contains a title, which is a string. And it contains a completed property, which is a bool. And we say we want, for instance, 10 of those. If I press Shift Enter, it will randomly create 10 items for me in JSON that I can just use. This payload, the moment I save and I close my window, it will be posted back to our API function. And we get a OK 200. That is good to go. Let's go check out what happened. So in SQL, of course, you can use Microsoft SQL Management Studio or any other SQL client. I use MS SQL CLI for this example. It's also installable as a global tool. And we connect to it by passing in the connection string to do DB. And let's see if we say select star from, oh, not that one. Select star from to-do database, we get a wonderful list of all the to-do items that's in our database. So the example I showed you now was output bindings. If we have another Azure function, let's just maybe copy this one. And we paste it in here and we call this get to-dos. And we name this get. One of the things we need to do here is we need to change this to a get as well, because it's the get HTTP attribute. And we'll say, you know, to do, we can either get all the to-dos or we can pass in a specific one that is a GUID, and it's also optional. So if we don't pass in a GUID, it's everything or the top 10. And if we pass in a specific ID, it will be parsed as a GUID, and it will try to figure out which one do we want. So the same thing goes But one small change, we're not referencing a table now, we're actually referencing a query. So what we'll do, we'll just add a little at here to be able to work better. And Copilot immediately suggests us a SQL function, but I actually want to change it a bit. Let's change this to if ID is null or ID is blank, right? Then we want to select everything. So we can say select, let's be specific, ID title completed from to do. And then else, it will generate the rest for us. ID title completed from to do. But in this case, where the ID is the ID that we pass in. One thing to note now is that we also need to give it a mapping towards the at ID item. So we do this by going parameters. And we say at ID equals, and this is the ID in the route we passed in. And another thing that we need to do here is the command type, which should be command type text. Great. For the rest, everything stays the same. But also, this is not an async collector. We can change this to a enumerable. There we go. We add that in there. That's good. So we still have a to-dos, which is the result set of that query. We can just go ahead and change this and remove this. We don't need async here in this case. We'll just keep it simple as an action result. And for the rest, everything should be working fine, I suppose. Now we can just say, return me a new OK object result. And the object here is to-dos. There is it. After a quick save, going back to our terminal, our .NET Watcher is busy picking up the changes. And after a quick compile, it has brought up our items that we expect, the create to-dos and the get to-dos. And let's test it out again. Quickly do that. And let's say, for instance, let's go to get API to-dos. So this will get the top 10 to-dos in the list, or actually get everything. To get the top 10, we need to just change the query a bit. We can just say select top 10, ID title completed, and if it's 1, we can just say select top 1. A very small change, but it could be a performance benefit if you use it correctly. And after a quick compile, we will see no errors, no warnings. That's great. And let's do this again. Get API to-dos. We expect 10, and there's the result set. So let's see, Ulamanku, or Ulamanku is, yeah, this one. Let's copy this ID. And let's say get to-dos, and we'll paste the ID in there, and we should be getting back an ID of Ulamanku, or Ulamanku. I don't even know how to say that, but in any case. So this is the quick and easy way on how we can actually use SQL input and output bindings to bind to SQL without actually using something like Entity Framework or SQL Client or whatever inside your functions, that it's natively handled as a SQL binding. Thank you so much for watching, and do take care, and do subscribe to my channel on YouTube and on Twitch. I do stream, I try to stream every weekday, Mondays and Thursdays, or whenever I can. So do go and check out my videos and my stream. And with that, happy coding, folks.